us, then I want us to remember that God can speak to us in lots of ways. Lots of ways. And sometimes God even speaks to us in silence. When people come to me as a pastor and they say, I'm having a hard time discerning, is this God or is this not? And I need confirmation, or should I take this path or that? Should I go to this school or that one? Should I take this job or that one? And I want to remind us that God speaks to us through the Bible and through prayer, through the voice of other Christians, through circumstances sometimes. But I think that also God speaks to us even through silence. And so today we're going to explore some silence. And we might even experience some of it later as we prepare ourselves for the Lord's Supper, because I want to invite us into some meaningful silence later in our life. Now, you might be saying, you're on the other end. You're often bored, or you're alone, or you're lonely, and there's too much silence in your life. And I think there are different kinds of silence. There's the silence of I'm sitting in the doctor's office waiting room and no one's talking to one another, but I'm thinking about all the things I could be doing while I'm sitting in this office waiting room, right? That is silence, but it's not very meaningful, right? But there's meaningful, intentional silence where we create space. We create space for God to speak to us. And I want us today to think about what it would mean for us as individuals just to create more silence, more intentional moments to really listen for God's voice. But I want to take us, into 1 Kings, and I'll give us just the context before we jump into this story of Elijah. The story that we're looking at today follows a really dramatic episode in Elijah's life where he is facing these prophets of Baal, these prophets of a false god, of another god, and he enters into kind of a competition with them. And he kind of makes fun of them, and they do this sort of competition. There's an altar there, and he challenges them to pray to their god to send down fire and consume this offering, and nothing's happening, and he even says, maybe your God's asleep. Maybe you need to be louder. And he's really making fun of them, and they're doing everything they can. And then Elijah prays, and God sends fire that consumes everything, even the stones. Everything is gone. It's like this amazing outpouring of God's power. And so you would think that as a follower of the Almighty God, that he would be walking high and proud, thinking, look at what my God has done. And instead, it takes one woman named Jezebel to threaten him, and suddenly he's on the run. Talk about the power of the voice of a woman, for good or bad. This is an example of bad. She threatens him, and he's on the run. And I'm thinking, wow, you stood up to all these prophets of Baal. She must have been a really intimidating woman, this Jezebel. And we find him in this episode on the run. He's run away from all that God has done because one person has threatened him. And he runs and he hides in a cave. And so today, as we jump into this amazing story, we find him there hiding in the cave. So let's see what happens with Elijah. So we're in 1 Kings chapter 19. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Now it's interesting because when God asks us where we are and what we're doing, it's not a geography question. It's a spiritual one, right? It reminds me when we think of Adam and Eve, and they sin, and God walks in the garden and says, "Where are you?" Well, where else could they be? He left them in the Garden of Eden. They've never been anywhere else, right? It seems like a stupid question. But it's not a question about geography, right? Where are you? Why do I feel this void? What's happened in our relationship? And in the same way, when God is saying, what are you doing there? It's not about motive. It's not about why are you in a cave and you should be outside. No. And he could even be saying to him, what are you doing there? Like, what's happening, or what are you doing there? There's a lot of ways he could be saying this to him. But the overall idea is, why are you here hiding and not back where I called you? And it's interesting because Elijah's giving him this speech, you know. Well, they've all given up, and where are the Israelites and all these people? Everyone's been killed, and now they're coming after me. Now, you've seen God send fire from heaven, and then suddenly you're questioning, and you're on the run, and you're hiding, right? Anybody ever play hide and seek growing up? Do you like that game? Yeah. It's really fun. And the younger the kids, the more fun it is, right? I love the really small ones where you say, we're going to play hide and seek, and they do this thing. And then you don't know what to say because you're like, I can see you even if you can't see me, right? I was on one of the thousands of planes I've been on recently, and there was the cutest little boy just a row away, and he was peeking over the seat like this. And so we were playing hide and seek for a while. And I was thinking how wonderful and innocent that is. But when we do it with God, it's the same idea, right? We think that we don't see God, so God doesn't see us. We run hide in a cave, or we play hide and seek with God. Some of you might even falsely think God just lives here, right? And so you come meet God here, and you dress up, and you look good, and you smell good, and you say nice things, and you think God only meets you here. And then we might go out into Berlin and do who knows what, thinking that God doesn't see us. But that's a bit like us just covering our eyes. I'm only going to look at God here, and then I'm going to walk around Berlin like this, pretending that I don't see God. Well, I want to tell you that God is at work in this city. No matter what people might say to you about Berlin, oh, Berlin, Sodom and Gomorrah, and sin-filled and godless and all that sort of thing. I find that God's doing amazing things right here in our church and in other churches. God is here working, right? And God is inviting us into that. And when we get intimidated by people questioning us, and we run and play hide and seek with God, and we go into our own form of cave, and God says, what are you doing there, you? It's not about where we are. God knows where we live and where we work and where we sin, and where we go pretend to hide. And he says all this to Elijah because he's saying, I've put you there. No, it's interesting where we find Elijah, because he's traveled to Mount Horeb, and this is the mountain where God called Moses and established the covenant and gave the 10 Commandments to him. So it's a really important place. But he's there feeling defeated. All those other people have abandoned me. No one's standing with me. I'm all on my own. And yet, God is saying, I'm here with you. Why are you hiding? What are you doing? But isn't it interesting? I know this never happens to you, but have you ever had people accuse you of something and you become very defensive? You give them all the list of the reasons why you're doing the wrong thing. From everyone else is doing the wrong thing to it's easier to do the wrong thing to I was scared to do the right thing and I wasn't sure what you were really calling me to do, God, so I've just stepped over here to do the thing that I know in my heart is wrong, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Well, that's exactly what Elijah's doing. He's like, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. But these Israelites have all forsaken you, and they've run, and they're dead, but I have been zealous. Of course, you want to hear the voice of God say to him, you're so zealous, you're hiding in a cave, bro. Is that where I called you? Did I call you to go hide? No, I've called you to be on mission. And so God is saying to him, I need you to go out. I need you to be about my business. You're not doing my business here. You're just hiding away. You're just hiding away. And so God is calling him to get back to where he's going to be. But it feels like, and God knows us. Isn't it wonderful that God knows when we need to be reassured, when we need to be convinced? Because even Elijah, who had this amazing, powerful experience, still needed to be assured of God's presence, still needed to hear from God. And I love that God comes to him and just says, what are you doing? What are you doing? And instead of giving him a big, mean, angry speech, he just says, hey, come out and stand at the edge of the cave for a minute. And this is the next part of the story, which is so powerful, right? So it says that he says to him in verse 11, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. We'll talk more about that in a second. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, what are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken you, right? Forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed the prophets with a sword alone. I alone am left, and they're seeking to take my life and take it away. And then the Lord said to him, oh, I understand. Just go hide in the cave. It's okay. I'll call someone else. I'm sure it's overwhelming and you feel sad when you're alone, so just sit there and be miserable and cry. No. What does he say to him? Then the Lord says, what's the word? Go. What does he say? Stay there? Go. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall appoint Hazael as king over Ephraim. He calls him back to mission, back to ministry, back to his task. It's interesting in this story because we see that God can get our attention in many ways. And God proves it, right? We have wind and earthquake and fire. He's getting his attention. He's saying, look, I am powerful, lest you doubt my power to do anything and everything. Right here, you have the biggest show you've ever seen, right? With wind, earthquake, and fire, right? But it's interesting because he's also saying, I can do anything, right? Reminds me of Jesus saying to the Pharisees when they're bragging about being the sons of Abraham, and he says to them, God can turn these stones into sons of Abraham. Like, what in the world is that? What's your bragging right? Or when he says to Job, who do you think you are? Who are you to question me, right? So God has this ultimate power, yet he knows our need. And he gets our attention out of all of these places, all of these things, right? God is capable of big and loud. And many times we're waiting on the big and loud. And sometimes God does that. Sometimes you can't miss it. Sometimes it's as big as an earthquake and fire and wind, where there's no denying that God is really speaking to you. But I find more often that God is speaking to us in a still small voice. In the voice in our heart as we pray. In the voice of others who don't even know what we're praying about, and they say, hey, I just have this thing that God's given me for you. I'm not even sure what it means. Which is, oh, by the way, why you need Christian friends who are praying for you. I feel so blessed to have a few people in my life who will literally call me up and say, I was praying for you, and I don't know what this means, but God said, I need to tell you. And it's exactly what I'm praying about. And from halfway around the world, God is using them to speak to me in a simple phone call, in a simple way, right? Now, it's interesting because this idea that God may speak to us in silence is very interesting. If you look at all the different translations that you have available to you in all the languages that you speak, you will find that this particular part of Hebrew is interesting and difficult to translate. Because you will have everything from a still small voice, right? Or a whisper. But ultimately, the Hebrew word there is really silence. That he hears God in the sound of silence. And this idea that we need silence is something that we don't always do very well with. Some religious traditions within Christianity do a better job with silence. Some have it built into their service. If you've come from a Catholic tradition, there's often a moment of silence once the priest finishes the sermon. For others, it's following a particular reading. We as Protestants, as evangelical Protestants in general, don't do very well with silence. We like to fill it with something. Something's always being played or said or spoken. In fact, I worked for a while in a church where if there was 2 seconds of silence, there was a meeting about it that week because it meant that something had gone wrong because it was the ultimate production, right? Every second was accounted for on a long script and everything was orchestrated, and it orchestrated all the silence right out of the service and any moment to catch your breath, just to absorb what God is saying to us in the music, in the prayers, in the sermon. And so I find it particularly challenging for we happy-clappy evangelical types because we like to be busy and big and loud, but really sometimes we also need the balanced diet of silence. In fact, I challenge people when I do some discipling with people to start their time of prayer with silence and imagining or even looking at a blank page and inviting God to write a word, a sentence, something on it. Not a hand that appears to write it. I mean, if that does happen, please tell me. That'd be super cool. You know, we see that in the Bible, you know, the hand that writes on the wall. But the idea is to clear the clutter, because most of us are never completely where our body is. Right now, several of you are asleep, but I know that God's giving you great rest. So it's wonderful. You're resting in the Lord. Maybe you're praying throughout this whole sermon. Others of you are already thinking about what you're going to have for food, what you need to get done the rest of the afternoon, your to-do list. Some of you are thinking about the World Cup tonight, and you better be pulling for Spain. Just kidding. Not really. But anyway, and so we have a hard time of really being present. And here we've worked as a team and musicians and others to put together this time of worship so that we could all hear from God, but there's a lot of distraction in our mind and in our heads. And we need this discipline of centering down and being present with the Lord. Because we're all waiting on, and it's easy to see the God in the earthquake and the wind and the fire, but what about the still small voice? You know, Jesus says, we see it in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, that the sheep know my voice, right? And when we know God's voice, it stands out to us even more. But you know how we know that voice? By spending time with God. And as we've talked about before, it's interesting when you've been married a long time, like Denise and me, 30 years this December. It still seems impossible, because I only feel 30 years old, so I'm not sure how that's possible. But I can just hear Denise across a crowded room say my name. Hundreds of people, and I hear Denise say Brian, and I know it's her. She's not shouting over the group, she's just saying Brian, and I know it's her. And I wonder, when we're in a space in our life where there are 1,000 voices and Jesus says our name, do we hear Jesus in the same clear way? And when Jesus says to us, "What are you doing here?" What are you doing here? What's your purpose? What's happening right now? Or what are you doing here in that place, running and hiding? Sometimes God needs to give us a new direction. Like he says to Elijah, go back, go back, go back. You know, sometimes God's voice is a silence where God isn't even speaking yet. Now hang on to this with me for a moment. Sometimes people say I'm in a phase where I'm praying, and I don't hear anything from God. But I have to believe that sometimes God's absolute silence, meaning God is not saying anything yet, can also be a gift. Because maybe what God needs to say to us, we're not yet ready to hear. That maybe the word that God has for us is going to be so big and so powerful and so challenging and maybe even overwhelming that God is waiting out of God's great love for us to the right moment where we might be ready to hear it. Because it might redirect our whole life. It might cause us to end a relationship we think we can't live without. It might cause us to let go of an addiction that has consumed our life. It might call us away from one job and one profession to a completely other one. And so when God seems silent, don't mistake God's silence for God not loving you. Because the whole Bible is a story of God loving us so much that God comes to us. The Bible tells us that God is close to us so that we can reach out and find God. God is not playing hide and seek with you or with me. When we don't hear God yet, it might be that we're not ready or that we have too many voices in our lives. It could be a lot of those things. I want to read to you, which is why I brought out this stool. Thought it might be nice to change of pace. I want to read to you from a tiny little book called A Testament of Devotion by Thomas Kelly. And you can see it's super tiny, right? So it's not an overwhelming thing until you open it. And then it is so deep that I read a paragraph and read a paragraph and read a paragraph. I've been reading this book off and on for probably about 15 years. And I find it's amazing that he speaks so clearly to our time, because this book, let me just look again at the date, this book was published, the copyright was 1941. This is a long time ago. And here's what Thomas Kelly says to us. He's talking about the simplified life. And he says, I have in mind something deeper than simplification of our external programs, our absurdly crowded calendars of appointments through which so many run frantically. These do become simplified in holy obedience, and the poise and peace we have been missing can be found. But there is a deeper and internal simplification of the whole of one's personality, stilled and tranquil in childlike trust, listening ever to eternity's whisper, walking with a smile in the dark. This amazing simplification comes when we center down. Everyone say center down. When life is lived with the singleness of I from a holy center where the breath and stillness of eternity are heavy upon us and we are wholly yielded to him. Wholly yielded to him. Some of you know this holy, recreating center of eternal peace and joy and live in it day and night. Some of you may see it over the margins and long to slip into that amazing center where the soul is at home with God. Be very faithful to that longing. It is the eternal goodness calling you to return home, to feed upon green pastures, and to walk beside still waters, and to live in the peace of the shepherd's presence. You know, God is inviting us into that peace. God is saying, I have so much for you if you allow me to speak into your life. If you would just allow me to be with you. But we must center down and look beyond the loud voices of our lives and to hear the simple whisper of God, which can bring challenge, but also fulfillment if we will both listen and obey. So I want to give us a few moments to practice this kind of silence. Together,